Buenos días con todos. I am Maria Rosa Vaquerizo. I'm the CEO of the Andean American Associations, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's program, Peru's Next Chapter. We're very pleased to welcome our expert speakers, and they are Alfredo Thorne of Global Source Partners, Richard Francis of Fitch Ratings, Simon Tegel, Foreign Correspondent in Peru, and our moderator, Augusto Rilova of Sherman. I would like to thank the sponsor of today's program, Global Source Partners, for its generous support. And thank you very much to our panel and attendees for your participation. A few words about the Peruvian American Associations for the people that are not aware. We have been founded in 1939. We're a non-for-profit organization, and this is the first chamber of commerce that was established for Peru in the United States. We provide a forum for the leaders that are shaping the future of Peru, and we are pleased to note that the speakers' view are their own view. They're not expressions of the chamber, and we are an apolitical organization. We have a great and remarkable turnout for today's program. We have over 120 registrants, and we would like to welcome a few of them. Bernardo Muñoz, he's the Trade Commissioner of Peru in New York. Juana Caicedo Sullinger, she's the President of the Ecuadorian American Association. William Sned of our Andean Supporting Member, BBVA. Jose Gonzalez of GCG Advisors. And we also have representatives from the World Bank, the US Trade Department, the New York Senate, key financial institutions such as BNP Paribas, BBVA, Citi, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, JP Morgan, MUFG, Santander, Sumitomo Mitsui, UBS, and Wells Fargo. We have major corporations, Glencore, and among others, and rating agencies, SP Global, and universities. We have from George Washington University and Harvard. Also, I would like to welcome correspondents from the media we have with us today, Bloomberg and Reuters, among others. I will briefly introduce our moderator. He's Augusto Rilova. He's a partner of Sherman and Sterling's project development and finance practice. Augusto, he's a native Spanish speaker and has over 15 years of experience working in the region, and is a versatile practitioner advising on project development and non-recourse financing, as well as acquisition financing of energy mining infrastructure projects in Peru, Mexico, Chile, and other countries in Latin America, Caribbean, and the US. He regularly advises lenders, borrowers, and sponsors across a broad spectrum of financing vehicles. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And before I pass the floor to you, I would like to explain to the audience that at the bottom, there's a Q&A button, and you can shoot any question that you want during the conference, and 20 minutes before we end, we will read the questions. So please feel free to use that button during the conference. And so, Augusto, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa, for that kind introduction. And thank you and welcome all of you for attending this seminar, Peru Next Chapter. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. The first one is Richard Francis. Richard is the co-head of the Sovereign Group at Fitch Ratings. He manages a group of sovereign analysts based in New York and spearheads the Sovereign Research Initiative in the Americas. Richard was the director for the Sovereign Group at Standard & Poor's. Next, we have Simon Tegel. Simon is a British journalist based in Lima since 2009. He's a regular contributor to the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and the Telegraph. Covers politics, human rights, and the environment, among many subjects. He focuses on the Andean region, but also runs across Latin America. Next, we have Alfredo Torne. Alfredo is now with Global Source Partners, Peru's country analyst. He's one of the prime economists and strategists in the region. He's a distinguished career spanning from the private sector and the government service, establishing himself as a leading authority in the country's economic development and the interaction between politics and economics. So I think the first panelists today that will give us their views on, I don't know if it's what's going on or what to expect. So I'll turn to you, Alfredo.
Okay, thank you very much. Hope you listen to me. I want to talk a little bit about politics and a little bit about economics. Unfortunately, in this context, it's difficult not to speak about politics. The first is what really happened. I think my first point is that this is not a new political crisis. This is a political crisis that has been brewing for a long time. And I think the news was of how the political crisis was resolved. Unfortunately, Castillo was a president that he himself came in a political crisis in Peru, where unfortunately our politicians lack the representation of the people at large, and he came with very little support, less than 10% of the votes in the first round, and he was part of the left groups of the Foro de Sao Paulo in all of the region that you probably know about them. And he essentially at the beginning wanted to impose a changing constitution and all the script that probably you know about. He couldn't implement his policies. He went into a big confrontation with Congress. He essentially appointed a bunch of cronies into the ministries. And unlike what he had promised in a campaign of being the president of the poor and the provinces, he essentially did very little for them. And we do have a very serious problems of disparities and even distribution in Peru, where yes, it's true that most of the benefits have concentrated in Lima, the capital, and not much has come into the provinces. And this sort of provincial versus Lima conflict, in my view, has aggravated, has not improved. So in this context, we have a president that was unable to deal with the situation. He decided to essentially govern by himself with no alliances with the rest of the politicians. And I would say the result was to be expected. He engaged into a confrontation with Congress. And from the very beginning, Congress wanted to impeach him. But at the same time, he essentially, as time went on, he gave all the reasons to Congress for the impeachment. He essentially was denounced by the Attorney General for corruption. They asked the Congress to essentially look into all the investigation that has taken place in the Attorney General. But unfortunately, there is an impasse in our Constitution. The Constitution protects the president. There's an Article 117, that says that the president can only be tried or sentenced for 4 crimes, and corruption is not one of them. So on December 7th, things came to a very, very high level of confrontation. And my interpretation, nobody really knows the truth, is that he panicked. And he essentially led a coup against Congress and against the courts. And that was the end of himself. Our Constitution and that article in the Constitution is very clear in terms of attempt against the constitution, and he essentially was deposed. I have to say that it was very surprising to see all the constitutional institutions coming out in the press and the different media explaining that this was a constitutional attempt, no? And that they pledged against disobedience of the orders that Castillo gave. It was ironic, but Castillo ordered a police general to go and put the attorney general in jail and to shut down Congress. Fortunately, that general never obeyed him. The armed forces essentially said that they only were loyal to constitutional governments, and that was the end of Castillo. Castillo was put in jail. And that's a little bit of where we are. Now, it would have been naive to think that there will not be protest. Castillo, for months and months, essentially had been preparing this. He knew that at some point he may be impeached, so he essentially prepared his support. And he gave budget allocations, he gave enhancements in terms of what, for instance, different groups can do in terms of, for instance, even creating a parallel police, etc., etc. So the fact that a protest essentially erupted was not a surprise. Not only that, but he allied with very extremist group. He released Antauro Humala, a radical mayor that attempted a coup in 2005 and was sentenced to 25 years in jail. And he even gave prefect's position to members of Movadef. Movadef is the party not officially recognized of Sendero Luminoso. If you remember, Sendero Luminoso was the guerrilla that led a very bloody fight against the army and against the whole of Peru. So what we are seeing now is that we are seeing a situation where obviously we have been pushed into an even deeper political crisis. We have certain groups. People are saying that these groups are no new, that they are essentially professional radicals, that what they are trying to do is that essentially grab power. And we have a group of countries that also have participated in this, but essentially in promoting even more this confrontation. What has the government done? Well, the government initially has been very ambivalent. Remember that Dina Boluarte was part of the Peru Libre Party, which was the party that led Castillo into government, but she essentially resigned to the party. She had differences with the leader of the party, Mr. Vladimir Cerrón, and she even had differences with Castillo. But in any case, at the beginning, the police was sent to ensure peace in the streets. That was insufficient. And last night, the government has declared state of emergency in all the nation. No? In a parallel process, they dismissed most of these prefects that were from Movadef. There were like 15 of them. And a negotiation has been opened on essentially 4 key demands from the population. One is that Congress shuts down. The second is new elections. The third is a referendum on a constitutional assembly. And the last is the release of Castillo. No? The first 2 are well documented in the polls. Nobody will deny. I think people really infuriated when they saw Dina Boluarte trying to stay until 2026, and essentially Congress also staying until 2026. It was a sort of confabulation that nobody liked. Congress is hated very strongly in Peru, so nobody wanted that Congress to stay. So one piece of the solution, which is what we are seeing today, is that essentially Congress brings forward elections. So we have early elections. The plan is to have that sometime in 2023. The last that has been committed is December 2023. But for that, there has to be a lot of changes. And most of the congressmen have argued, I would say rightly, that that has to be accompanied with a revamp of our electoral system. Otherwise, we will have essentially the same situation that we had in the past, which essentially means that we had 6 presidents in 6 years, which is really crazy, no? What does that mean? That means that they will have to approve constitutional amendments, first for the early elections and second for the electoral system. The plan is that they have to approve first in 2 different legislatures with 87 votes in each of them, or simple majority in one and a referendum in the second. The plan is that they are discussing that today, but the plan is that they approve a first package now in December. The other 2 demands, which is the Constitutional Assembly and the Castillo release, I think there is no support in the population at large for that. The Constitutional Assembly is pressed by a few, and for most is seen as a way of turning a democratic government into an authoritarian government similar to Venezuela and Cuba. And that is not approved by most of the population. And Castillo release, unfortunately, Castillo has committed a serious crime in Peru, is penalized. We had a different president that did exactly the same thing, that was Mr. Fujimori in 2000, and he was kicked out of government. And it took us, the Peruvians, many years to bring back democracy and put together our political system. So I think, irrespective of anyone could say, Castillo will have to face justice. He will have to face a fair trial. But at the time we are speaking, the Attorney General has essentially started the second phase of the investigation, which is a preparatory investigation, and has asked for 18 months of imprisonment of Castillo. So I think he's not going to be released. So where does that put us in terms of what are the positive and the negative outcome? The positive outcome is that I think we have a chance of fixing up our political system, of passing some constitutional amendments and fixing up the things in the constitution that we need to fix in terms of turning Peru into a mature democracy. What is the risk? The risk is that we fail to incorporate all these sectors that have been protesting and are mainly in the South. And my view, at least that's my personal view, that incorporation of those sectors is not only political, but is also economic. I think we cannot bypass the fact that most of these sectors outside Lima have not reached out the benefits of our fast growth in the years from 2001 to 2014, 2015, and we need also deep economic reforms. I can talk a little bit more about it in the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, for the point of view. So moving to the economical impact of this, Richard, what can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, we from the ratings perspective, we actually put the Peru on a negative outlook back in October. We thought this kind of very weak equilibrium between the president, Castillo, and the Congress was not sustainable, and sure enough, it definitely wasn't sustainable. And we've had the events over the past week or so. And I think one thing that we had said historically was that it seemed for whatever reason that the politics and the economics were kind of delinked, that Peru could grow and grow pretty strongly despite kind of these political dysfunctionalities. And I think that was something that we were noting had changed. Private investment was falling to pretty much zero. Possibility that it goes negative even. Public investment, because of the kind of the dysfunctionality of the government, was also at risk. You had the joke is you had like one minister per week, and under Castillo, we've had 3 finance ministers under Castillo, and now we're on the 4th finance minister. And just the ability to get anything done in that kind of situation is can't happen. And then obviously, you've had the problems with the blockages at the mines. That was impacting mining production. And then I think also even in the mining sector, you've had you still have a pipeline of investment, but that investment's gone it's gone down way down. And this is in the context of relatively high copper prices. So I think that whole kind of situation was partly behind the negative outlook. That said, I mean, we still expect we were expecting around 2% growth next year. So I mean, it's not horrible, it's not great, and that's despite the fact that the U.S. is going into recession. Europe is going recession. A number of countries in Latin America are going in recession. So, in relative terms, Peru doesn't look that bad. I think with this dysfunctionality, though, and this political crisis in Peru, certainly even that growth prospect, could be much more negative. And we'll have to see how long this the situation lasts. As Alfredo said, I think the idea is that we're going to have early elections. That alone creates a lot of uncertainty. Maybe possibly, if they're able to do the political reforms, like Alfredo said, then the situation could absolutely improve. But I think right now there's just a lot of uncertainty. So we'll have to see how that goes. And I think the other strength of Peru is, the fiscal deficits have been very under control for a long time. Debt to GDP rose pretty significantly during the pandemic, but it still remains really low, below 35% of GDP. One of the lowest in Latin America, actually. So I think, and then on the external, the international reserves cover like 10 months of current account payments. So there's a lot of very economic strengths that Peru has. I think the other thing, is this slowdown in growth that we've seen over the past years. Peru was growing 4, 5, 6% a decade ago. Now it's growing 2 to 3%, and I think that means that poverty is not going to be reduced. The middle class is not going to grow as strongly, and this could feed into a vicious cycle, basically, if that continues, and that obviously has a political element as well. And I think that's another risk. With copper prices where they are, Peru should be growing at 4 or 5%, and it's just not. And I think this again goes back to my original statement, which is this kind of disconnect that Peru historically had between politics and economics. I think that's broken down, and now you're seeing that yes, politics does have an impact on economic prospects.
Thank you very much for that not so bad assessment of the situation of our country. Simeon, as almost an adopted Peruvian after living here for so long, what can you tell us? What can you tell us about how you see the protests, the chances of Boluarte? What is your analysis?
So I think first of all, I agree broadly with Alfredo's analysis. Looking forward, I think there isn't actually an obvious quick fix. Unfortunately, I think the instability and the political conflict could continue. I think Dina Boluarte, she got off to a bad start by saying she was going to be president. She was going to see out the current presidential term to 2026. I'm glad to see that she quickly backtracked, has now made it clear she's a transition president and is talking about elections initially in 2024, but is now also talking about 2023, which I think is absolutely necessary. There's no getting away from that. I mean, on the one hand, there is an obvious quick fix, which is bringing elections forward and political reforms, but it's much, much more complicated than that, achieving that. I mean, there are various problems with bringing the elections forward. Some of them are logistical and legal, but the two bigger issues are that Congress is going to resist that. They're not going to do so explicitly by saying we want to stay till 2026, but they're going to do everything they can to drag this out. Today's the last day of the current legislative session until the next one starts next year. So they're probably going to try, I'm going to predict, to not get anything done today while looking sympathetic to kind of the demands of ordinary Peruvians. And then they're going to hope that when they resume, the next session starts next year, the sting will have been taken out of the situation and they can carry on delaying. So that's on the one hand. The other issue is if you want these and you need these political reforms to be in place for the next elections, that's December 2023 for the next elections is a really tight time frame. They probably need to be in 2024. There's various reforms that people are talking about that could help to make Peruvian politics more representative and more stable. A couple of them I think Congress will go for. One of them is allowing successive re-election for members of Congress. The benefit of that is that you would have a lot less legislative neophytes in the Congress, but that would also allow them to run for election again, which of course they want to do. The other one is bringing in a second chamber, a Senate. The idea is that, a more deliberative upper chamber might kind of curb some of the excesses of the current single chamber that we have. That would also be more jobs for politicians. So I could see those being passed. But there are various other ones that I think are really key to kind of moving past this instability and this persistent conflict between the executive and the legislature that we've seen since 2016, really before 2016, but it really became kind of a crisis when Keiko Fujimori lost the presidential runoff in 2016, but had a majority in Congress and wouldn't accept the result of the presidential election. She accepted the result of the congressional election, but not the presidential election. So one of the first ones is to have the congressional elections run after the first round of the presidential election. So either with the runoff election, if there is one, or if there isn't one, on the same date that the runoff election would have happened, and that would give the president, whoever they may be, a chance to actually have a congressional majority, a legislative alliance, or at least more presence in Congress to protect them from basically political warring. That would be one. Another one, which I think is absolutely fundamental, is primaries, and preferably open primaries. Currently, you really have a closed party system in Peru with very high barriers, deliberately so, for new parties to register, while the registration of existing parties, these party registrations, they're like gold. They've got certain individuals who basically are running fiefdoms and who are still, even after reforms that Vizcarra brought in, picking or allowed to, and most are, picking candidates. It's the party bosses picking the candidates. So, I mean, that's just a recipe for corruption, backroom dealing, and politics that is not representing ordinary Peruvians. In terms of the protests, I think what's striking is, although they're very violent and they're causing a lot of problems in Peru, we're having closing various airports and that kind of thing. I think it's important to understand the number of protesters, it's not that many. And I think there are a range of interests there. Some of them definitely are far left agitators who don't believe in democracy. They're basically revolutionaries of one strand of Marxism or another who are seeing the opportunity. There are some criminals who are just opportunistically taking the chance to loot. But there's an awful lot of Peruvians, the most marginalized Peruvians, who've been, as Alfredo was mentioning, who've been marginalized for a very long time outside of Lima, who are really suffering and who believed in Pedro Castillo. They were taken in by these really quite ridiculous sometimes populist campaign promises he was making. But for reasons of identity, they identified with him. They felt he represented them and have been incredibly let down by him. Some of them realized Pedro Castillo himself did not live up to his own rhetoric. Some don't. But just to put in a bit of context as well, the social unrest, Peru has had the worst COVID-19 mortality in the world. So that's having all kinds of social effects. There are lots of families that have lost breadwinners, or even if people haven't died, they're maybe not able to work, or plus they've also, of course, lost opportunities to work. The other thing is Peru now has this terrible crisis of food insecurity. Half of Peruvians are suffering food insecurity. That's twice the level before the pandemic, and it's going to get worse. We have a drought in the southern Andes, which is already affecting harvests, and we're seeing livestock dying. And then Peru needed 500,000 tons of fertilizer that it normally would import from Ukraine and Russia. And the Castillo government has, excuse me, I have a cold, completely failed to address that. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, I think. And just finally, I think when you look on the horizon, the political actors, I'm not sure who there is on the horizon that can provide leadership at the party level, but also in terms of individual candidates. Dina Boluarte, her first political office, elected office, was vice president. She's very inexperienced. We're seeing that already. And her cabinet is largely technocratic. It lacks political experience. And I think you really need, at this very difficult moment, you need a cabinet, a prime minister, and a president who are very skilled politically with a lot of experience. So I think with leadership from her and her cabinet, I could see you channeling the outrage that most Peruvians feel into really forcing a recalcitrant Congress into passing reforms that in many cases are going to eventually put them out of jobs or careers in politics. But I don't know that Dina Boluarte and her cabinet have the skill and experience to do that. And just to finish, in terms of the new candidates, parties and individuals who would run in the next election, right now I don't see anyone who would necessarily be able to provide really the strong, stable leadership out of this crisis. And it's possible that when you look at some of the polling before Castillo was ousted, who might be the next president if elections are held soon, there's some pretty worrying candidates out there, populists on the left and the right, who really aren't Democrats and who also aren't very interested in the intricacies of public policy and economic policy. So, I don't think that things are necessarily going to get better very soon. They could, but I'm skeptical.
Thank you, Simon, very much for that. That's very comprehensive and interesting. So, Alfredo, my perception of the demands, and tying it a bit to what Simon just said, is that they are very of the political side, and in my view, I just don't think that people really understand what changing the constitution will get them, right? Like, I feel people want immediate relief to certain things, the fertilizer prices, the insecurity of food, but but certainly, I've been hearing more and more this argument about this being a political crisis, and we needing a leader, we needing more political savviness, and that's clearly not what Boluarte is going to offer. That's not what her cabinet is going to offer. They're asking for the prime minister to resign and to be appointed. In some respects, where you were a minister for PPK, similar questions were raised, right? Like about leadership, about maybe peso político, you had an extraordinarily good cabinet. You were technically the best, but having the Fujimori Congress that you had, it seemed like we needed more. How do you compare the two situations? Of course, how do you compare the two situations? You're immune, Alfredo.
I think it's an interesting question. It's a question that sort of come to my mind every time and again. I think we have to separate these two issues. I think clearly we have to set the rules of the electoral system clear, and Simeon has mentioned some of them, and those are the change in the constitution. Yes, I will agree with you that nobody will understand how does a Senate, for instance, will get more crops in my small plot of land. But that's the reason why you have to split the problem. You will have a political response, which are these reforms that are being discussed in Congress, and I think we can agree or disagree on what Simeon has said, but certainly it has to be enough to ensure that we are not going to return to these recurrent crises that we have had in the past. No? That essentially we ensure a certain level of governance that allows the new president to govern, and that the new president is a decent president, because the problem with Castillo is that it was a president of minorities, not a president of majorities. No? But in any case, that's one area. The other area, the government has to be revamped. No? And yes, everybody says, well, Dina Boluarte is not able, but I do think that there are certain people in her cabinet that can do a pretty good job. No? I think, for instance, this Hanna Perez de Cuellar, that is the head of Vivienda, is a decent person. The new person that has been put in Transportes is decent. I'm not going to tell you that they are fantastic, but there are very few things that you need in order to gain the popular support. No, first, a deep social program. No, that can be done out of the budget. Doesn't require a lot of hard work. Second, you have to unlock most of the government investment. This is like 56, like 5% of GDP that you can immediately put to work. Third, you have to enroll the private sector. You have to launch a credibility shock for the private sector. You have like, I don't know, I lost track of the number, but you have like $40–50 billion of mining projects and other infrastructure projects that are ready to go. And the problem is that nobody believes in the current administration. You have to unlock those, no? And last, I think you can put together a few key infrastructure projects with the government to government scheme that actually we designed while I was a minister. For instance, you have what PPK offered, this coastal train. You can essentially auction that and ask, I don't know, the UK, France, or whoever government to execute that project. It's a $5 billion that will take, I don't know, 5 years. But the moment that you start showing some progress in terms of reaching out the population in the rural areas and in the cities, that's the time when you are going to turn around this. For instance, Simeon has talked about the fertilizers. I don't know how difficult it is to bring fertilizers into Peru. The problem with Castillo is that Castillo essentially wanted to grab a cut in every single contract that he put in place. But if you essentially call a few companies and the private sector to buy the fertilizers and sell it in the different shops in Peru, and that the government can subsidize the price, that will be an immediate response. The agriculture, as Simeon said, is in deep crisis. There is no water, etc. But it's not very difficult to reach those levels in terms of, for instance, bringing water, making sense of who gets the water, and all of the things that has to be done. It's true, Dina Boluarte probably is not the right person, but like most states, you can bring consultants into the state, and this is not a poor state. This is a state that, for instance, has a lot of space in the budget to execute these expenditures. No.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's interesting whether Dina Boluarte is or not the right person. I think the experience with Francisco Sagasti and having someone that, you know, was neither here nor there, it was not the focus of the problem. I feel it did us a lot of good, you know, and he let people work and, you know, manage the crisis. It's, again, not a big fan of Dina, but it's certainly, I mean, when I saw what she was doing, I mean, my first impression was that she was, I mean, except for the 2026, which I thought it was more a political move. But yes, certainly, what I hear you saying, there's some simple fix that will have a lot of impact, and that will be, I think, good for certain parts of the population that feel marginalized.
But the way our government is organized allows you to have a monarch that is the president and someone that executes the government, no? And I think if you have a good prime minister that is well ordered and has a good relation with Congress, I think things can work. For instance, take the case of security. Otarola, the Minister of Defense, is the one that essentially has decided everything, no? Dina Boluarte at the end has had to sign the supreme decrees, but the one that is designing the whole strategy is the defense minister with the interior minister, the armed forces, and then all the members of the democracy unit, which is the attorney general, the judicial system, etc., etc. So I think I will be a little bit more positive. I think what we all know is that we are very fed up with where we have reached in Peru. And I think that's a point of, in my view, of no return. I don't know if we can fall even deeper, but I think certainly from here, you can start growing up, no?
Let's hope. No hay mal que dure 1000 años. Richard, so moving to the economy, so what are the risks you see, you know, going forward, and you know, what would lead? Because I think one of the biggest advantages that, you know, governments still have is the ability to borrow relatively cheaply due to its very good international rating. So what do you see what the risks are for Peru, and what could lead to an actual rating downgrade, and whether you're considering analyzing that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the beginning, you know, we have a negative outlook, which means there's downside risks. I think, you know, the fact that, you know, you have this political uncertainty, you're going to have this political uncertainty at least for a year. You have an inexperienced president. Maybe you have a technical cabinet that knows what they're doing, but I think, as Simeon said, they lack the political experience, and I think you need both in different positions. So I think ultimately this will undermine private investment. I think probably the capacity of the public sector to execute is pretty low, and I don't think that's going to improve. at least in the near term. And then you have all these the protests, which if you just think about what tourist is going to want to go to a country where you have massive protests, especially in the countryside, where that's where most of the tourists want to go. And then there is a chance that if the protests got worse, that you could have an impact on the mining sector. So I think there's a lot of downside risks. I think the supporting factors from the ratings perspective is just the low fiscal deficits, the very low debt to GDP, and pretty strong external position with international reserves covering 10 months of current account payments, which is one of the strongest in the triple B category, especially in Latin America. So I think Peru has a lot of fundamentals. I could see those fundamentals deteriorating. And then you've had this really sharp, and one of the biggest factors in sovereign ratings is governance. And that's what you've seen. If you look at the World Bank governance indicators, you've seen a really sharp decrease in those governance indicators over the last 5 or 6 years for obvious reasons. And actually this past year, when the numbers came out, Peru was the worst, had the sharpest fall in governance indicators of any rated sovereign by Fitch. So that just shows the degree that it's fallen. And I think I can only think that when the next round comes out in September of next year, that's going to fall even further. And I think that just highlights the political instability, the government effectiveness, the control of corruption. All these issues are tied into the governance indicators. So, and you've seen a real sharp fall in them. So I think a combination of governance, economic growth, and maybe some deterioration because of these things. On the fiscal side, you could actually see debt to GDP start to rise. And those would be the risks that we're looking at. That said, we put the negative outlook in October. We've had this pretty big crisis over the past couple of weeks. I think the fundamentals of Peru give us some time to see how the events play out over the next few months, at least. So I think for now, there's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction to downgrade, unless something really goes wrong, which is a possibility too, right?
Yeah, always full of surprises for sure. So we have a question from the audience that I think you addressed in one of your articles, but not all of us are subscribed to the Washington Post. But so what do you think was the motivation for the governments of Mexico, Bolivia, Colombia, and Argentina to express support for Castillo? And maybe you can also mention, I saw you tweeted Mujica talking about it, which much more sense. So,
well, I think, unfortunately, that what it means is that those four presidents, Arce, AMLO in Mexico, Fernandez, and Petro, they're not fully Democrats. I mean, we already knew that about Arce in Bolivia. It was very clear about AMLO in Mexico, the various things they've been doing in each of their own countries, that they're not Democrats. Argentina's more complex, though I'm not sure that, you recall the Kirchners or the Peronismo in recent years, authoritarian or anti-democratic, certainly corrupt maybe. Petro perhaps is the disappointing one. I mean, I think, he has his background as this former leftist guerrilla who is now president. And, I've spoken to Colombians whose opinions I respect, who were kind of seeing it both ways, that, yeah, he is a risk to democracy, and others saying, no, it'll be fine. During his inaugural speech, he went out of his way to emphasize there wouldn't be political persecution in Colombia when he was president. And now he's signed on to this document, which is really disappointing. I mean, there's plenty to criticize about Congress and the impeachments they were attempting previously, before Castillo kind of had this brainwave and decided to launch his failed coup. I mean, there was real, I'm putting it politely, issues of constitutional legitimacy about those impeachments. Even if Castillo was an awful, corrupt president who deserved to be kicked out, the question was, how do you do that constitutionally within Peru's system, which is really it's pretty clear now the current constitution is just inadequate in multiple ways. But once he went on TV to announce he was dissolving Congress and was going to rule by decree, I mean, that all went out the window. It was clearly an attempted coup. He was removed constitutionally, necessarily, and then for these governments to then put out these say that he's still the constitutional president of Peru, and not mention, they don't even mention, him saying that attempting to dissolve Congress is very problematic. It's intromission in Peru's internal affairs. I think one of the signs that Boluarte is struggling to live up to her new responsibilities is that there hasn't been a stronger response from the Peruvian government to that. I know the Mexican ambassador was called in for a talking to by the Peruvian foreign ministry, but I think the ambassadors from those other countries should be as well. What's motivating those four governments? I think that partly ideology. It's more important to them supporting a fellow leftist than supporting rule of law and democracy in Peru. And just to finish, I mean, Mujica has understood it very clearly in that retweet that you mentioned. I mean, he's coming out and condemning what Castillo did. Lula in Brazil has been very clear that Castillo violated the constitution. So has the government in Chile, Boric. They've been very clear about it. So it seems there's a real dividing line over Peru, what just happened, amongst the Latin American left. And if you want to know who's a real Democrat and who isn't, just look at where they are on that debate.
Yeah, no, certainly it was what appeared to me in terms of, who was trying to, preemptively say, I can do this kind of thing, and you shouldn't be concerned because I'm not being violating the Constitution. So maybe, just to wrap up, if each of you can give maybe an idea or more going forward, because I think that I guess it seems like there's no clear. We all have in mind how long is this going to last? The unrest. How can we appease it? How can we convey? And this is one of the questions also from the public. To the public that patience in some respect is key. I think immediate action is needed. There's concrete things that need to be done, but there is a long game here, right? And if you are really asking for political reform, I mean, if the protesters are really asking for political reform for referendum or for a new constitution, those are things that they won't solve your problems today. They as Alfredo was saying, we should divide both things and work in parallel. But maybe some gesture, right? Like, I don't know, like I also heard that there was a colectivo Valentín Paniagua asking, to replace the president by president of Congress, which to me, sounded like a good gesture. But could that be enough for the protesters? How many of those are really motivated to convey their, I'm angry about what happened, or how many? Because I don't feel that they support Castillo necessarily. I think they're just really angry with Congress, and some of these political gestures, together with some, immediate action, make people feel that they were heard in some respect.
I think that's part of the problem. There, this range of demands, this spectrum of demands, and it's really hard to see how. Certainly, will require some pretty significant leadership. You can bring them all together. On the one hand, there are people who are demanding that Castillo is freed and returned to the presidency. That's not going to happen. Then there are people who just want Congress gone and new elections, and that probably is going to happen. The question is, exactly when, late 2023, early 2024. Some of them want it earlier than that, but then you don't get the political reforms. You just get more of the same from the elections. I think one of the things we know is that before Castillo was impeached, polls were showing 80, even 90% of people Peruvians saying that if he goes, then Congress has to go as well, which Congress is now trying to resist. So you've got these different demands. Then there's other people, maybe you'd call them the intelligentsia, who are talking about the political reforms and understand that. I don't know how, most Peruvians in the street, how much they understand that or have bought into that. And I think that's a key issue. And again, this is where you need leadership to explain to the population, yes, we're going to have new elections, but we have to do these political reforms first if we want to get out of this vicious circle, or not even circle, it's a spiral, a downward spiral of governability. So, and this is where really, Dina Boluarte has her work cut out, I think. I think it would be possible with the right leadership to kind of bring people together, create this momentum and push Congress in the right direction. But I'm just skeptical that leadership exists right now in Peru, unfortunately.
How would you, Alfredo? Like, what would you say, like a strong, Golden Limon? What would be, in your view, something that could, I don't know if it's like a number of small things, which is what I heard from some people, or something really, strong to pass a strong message that we're hearing, you guys. We're taking action,
Look, I think, I don't know, I will be more positive than Simeon. I believe that we have sort of hit a crossroads where both the government now without Castillo and Congress realize that they need to do something quick. The political reforms, in my view, is something that is overly diagnosis, and we all know what those political reforms are. No, some of us believe that it should go a little bit more one direction than the other. But I think if we sit down and say, and you go into any congressman and allow a list, they will say, these are the reforms I will agree with. So I think my sense is that can be materialized relatively quickly. I agree with Simeon that it would be a huge mistake to go into a new elections without a revamping of the electoral system. Then the process of calling elections, I think of calling early elections, I also agree with Simeon. When you look at the polls, the population at large is massively in favor of new elections. So the moment that hits the news, I think that would be a game changer in my view. I think if today, for instance, Congress says, okay, we're going to go for early elections and we are going to have a new legislature. The idea is that they will bring forward the January legislature and that they will work all of December and pass a bunch of reforms. I think if that message hits the press later today or during the week, I think that would be a good political gesture. I agree with you that people may not feel, they will not feel involved in this, but the moment these people start voting in primaries in the different parties, engaging in politics, I think, and essentially participating in politics, I'm a strongly believer that electoral districts have to be smaller in terms of gaining more representation. But the moment people are engaged in this process and they realize that the system is moving in their direction, my sense is that things are going to start moving and benefiting the population at large. I also agree with Simeon that we are not going to see a radical change in a few months. Boluarte is a transition government. She's not a permanent government. So I don't think the eyes are going to be put in Boluarte. The eyes are going to be put in who is going to be the person that brings those changes. And when they say changes, I mean the true economic changes and the true economic transformations that need to take place. And those probably is going to be the manifesto of the new government, no? And I think we have to be patient. In terms of of Peru, I think I always say this: the government has been destroyed and needs to be revamped, but the private sector is intact. We have not suffered expropriations. We have not suffered any major change that could affect the capacity of the private sector to respond quickly to a change in policies. And that is a plus. I think Richard will agree with me. Our fiscal situation is enviable. No, we have think about the minister wanted a 2.5% deficit, 2% of GDP deficit this year. We're going to have around 1.2. No, at this time when we were doing our forecast, we were forecasting debt to GDP ratio to be around 38%. It's going to be 34 in gross terms. In net terms, it's less than 20%. So if we fix this governance issue that Richard has emphasized, I think that could be a major leap forward for Peru. No?
Thank you, Alfredo, Richard, and Simeon. It's great talking to you. Maria Rosa, go now to you for final remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Augusto. For the Peruvian American Association, it's a pleasure to promote this great discussion and analysis. We have been very fortunate to have 4 experts with us, and the program has been just amazing. And I want to thank Alfredo, Richard, Simeon, and Augusto for sharing your expertise and your views on how to get Peru and its majority out of these volatile times. It was very reassuring to hear potential solutions coming out from this panel. And for the Peruvian American, we have today a lot more to think of Peru Next Chapter. We will be doing more programs in the near future. And before I close, I would like to thank our fantastic team, Linda Calvet, Alexandra Vaquerizo, Lori Dominguez, and also our program committee, Roxana Paucar and Sofia Tong from Peru. If anyone is interested in this nonprofit organization, make sure you answer our invitation of today, and you can reply to the staff, and we can give you all the information that you require. Thank you all for participating, and we wish you a happy holidays and look forward to meeting with you again soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.